Salutations, exiles. Wait a second. Salutations, exiles? Travelers? What do I even say? Anyway, are you coming from PoE and want to build a familiar, satisfying, and viable build? Perfect, because this is the So You Want to Play series. So you want to play iShot Deadeye from PoE, but also want to try out the hottest new ARPG in town, Last Epoch, right? Okay, let's see how close we can get to replicating iShot Deadeye in Last Epoch. Before we start, let's really quickly look at what an iShot build plays like in PoE. If you're familiar at all with PoE, this shouldn't be anything new. We won't be able to perfectly replicate the build, but we can get pretty close. Here's iShot in PoE. And now here's our iShot in Last Epoch. Technically, it's not actually iShot, but more on that later. In PoE, often you'll see iShot and on-hit bow users spec into critical chance, and the same is true in Last Epoch. In Path of Exile, you'll often see dexterity stacking affixes leading players to stacking high amounts of dexterity, and guess what? It's not required, but that's also something we can do in Last Epoch. Typically in PoE, you'll have more projectiles than use barrage or single target. While we won't be using a barrage setup the exact same way as we would in PoE, it'll still be useful for us in Epoch. Another key difference between the two is that we won't be shooting multiple projectiles like we do in Path. Pack sizes between the two games are pretty different, so the single cone we get from our faux iShot in Last Epoch will be plenty, and if we really wanted to, we can scale up its AoE later. Now, let's dive into the meat of how we're doing this in Last Epoch. Detonating Arrow. If you play as the rogue class and pick the marksman ascendancy, congrats, you'll have a host of strong skills to choose from, including Detonating Arrow. It plays very similar to Explosive Arrow from PoE, firing an arrow with a payload that explodes after a short delay. The only difference between the two skills at their base is that Detonating Arrow is a lightning skill as opposed to PoE's Explosive Arrow, which is fire. However, when we look at the skill specialization tree that LE brings, things can get pretty spicy. By taking the Frostfang Arrow keystone in the lower left section of the tree, we convert our lightning damage to cold. Then, by taking the ironically named Barrage keystone to the northwest of the tree, we have our explosion be instantaneous instead of on a timer, and we also fire the ability in a cone shape as opposed to a circle. That's pretty cool, huh? Get it? Cool. Anyway, we aren't done just yet. In the background, I'll be showing off two build variants taking on some endgame content. One that's a bit more budget-oriented, and one with slightly more expensive or rarer gear, including uniques. I've also tested the build's viability by pushing Arena past 200 waves, which puts me at, number 30? I'm not quite sure. On the leaderboard right now for Rogue. During the run, I opted not to use the incredibly powerful decoy skill as it is a bit cheesy, and instead I wanted to rely on the strength that Detonating Arrow and Freezes alone. A 5-skill build can definitely push past wave 210 in my opinion. Alright, so let's look at the build and the passive tree first. The tree and gear are optimized for survivability instead of simply damage, but the build has a lot of depth and options to fit a player's personal preference. It's also starter viable, but I should note that certain uniques of the idols might come into the fold a little bit later. Pre-mastery, just go for a traditional flurry or shuriken max setup, and once you're level 25, you'll be able to spec into the marksman tree, and things will really start to come together. Early on in the tree, I'd go either for the left or middle nodes, opting for health or damage as I see fit. The dexterity from steady hand helps our defenses and damages a bit, but it becomes even more useful in terms of damage as we pick up our unique boots, the Morning Frost. The haste chance and increased damage from agility on the rogue passive tree is nice, but I could see people's reasons for not really using it. Considering it's one of our only sources of haste though, I do like it even at the 1 second duration. I'm still a fan of glancing blows after the nerfs it received recently, and as a rogue you can obtain it pretty easily, so I take dodge and parry and also opt for sapping strike since we'll want it for mana sustain when we use Detonating Arrow. This currently puts me at 32 points on my tree, but you'll want to spec into the marksman tree as soon as possible, so I'd opt for leaving points out of steady hand or swift assassin until later down the line. The choice to spec into Blade Dancer for a little bit might be a bit odd, but remember I'm gearing this build towards damage and survivability. It sucks taking 2 passive points into Pursuit and not getting any bonus from melee damage, but unlocking the Shroud of Dusk passive is super nice. I wouldn't do this until later though, because with decent equipment you should be fairly survivable early, and the only thing you'd really want from Blade Dancer before investing too much is simply taking the Glancing Blow chance to dexterity if you're running the dex stacking version of this build. Now let's take a look at the marksman tree. There's a few debate picks here, and I'm by no means saying this tree is viable. I opt for Elemental Arrows and Assassin's Quiver for the damage, and I spec into the movement speed portion of the concentration tree specifically for Arena as I wanted high MS to kite efficiently. Siege Quiver is nice, and it helps round out my resistances occasionally. Heightened Senses, Crit Avoidance, and Multi is an amazing defensive tool and offensive option, especially for Arena, and that Crit Multi, which acts as a more multiplier, is just awesome because we'll be critting so much. I don't spec very heavily into Woundmaker for the crit vulnerability for a couple of reasons which we'll see down the line, but depending on where the build is at right now, if you need more crit chance, it's a very powerful node to make sure you're getting the most of your damage. I got 1 point in Thief's Quiver, and it's nice, but that's mostly an afterthought and where I'm taking my last points as I'm hitting level 100, so don't really worry about it too much. The big things to note farther up on the tree are 1 point in Fire and Steel, so we maintain our elemental arrow boosts only for Detonating Arrow, Sniper's Gambit for a huge flat damage boost at the cost of some survivability, but and the max allotted Arrow Storm passives for massive surge in damage every 10 seconds. 1 point into Covering Fire is an excellent defensive option, more not so useful, and I rounded out the tree with some points in Sharpshooter, 2 points in Barrage of Pain, and 1 point in Death from Afar, and the rest of our allotted points in Perfect Aim. Like I mentioned before, this is only a rough guideline, and as you can see, I've played around with what I find comfortable in terms of breakpoints to consistently proc the powerful effects I'm going for. You could totally make the case that Barrage of Pain should have more investment, especially if you're missing crit on gear, and the Armor Shred and Stun chance from Death from Afar? It's really only meh. Useful, but not exactly what the build is going for. Now, let's take a look at these skills. I'll go over the utility ones first and keep it simple. Smoke Bomb is a strong defensive tool and a getaway cleanse. I take the backflip node called Escape Tactics because it allows for a quick animation cancel that the regularly thrown Smoke Bomb doesn't allow for, like this. Compare that to this. Besides that, there's a bit of utility here, but you could really take it any way you want. Spec for more crit chance by taking Shadow Hunter, going for more glancing blow chance by speccing further into rapid concealment. You get the point. Initially, I had my shift set up to cleanse ailments, but I really didn't like the slight cooldown increase and instead swapped my ailment cleanse to my smoke bomb as shown before. For that reason, I use my shift as a movement skill, obviously, but also a way to juice up my damage with a ton of jagged jade arrows. I use it for a little bit of utility as well, with a nice 1.5 second movement speed buff for momentum, and the life-saving rebound node, which gives you a refund of the cooldown if you take a hit that does more than 50% of your HP. It doesn't always proc, but when it does, holy moly, it's strong. My decoy is pretty standard, going for enemy cold resistance shred and some utility. I could see you increasing its duration instead by speccing more lasting presence right here, but I like where it's at as a defensive dummy and something that inflicts strong debuffs to the enemy. Now, Flurry is our barrage-like setup, but ultimately our damage, even single target, isn't really coming from Flurry. We're speccing it for as much attack speed as possible, and we want it to be our mana generator. Its damage isn't awful, but it's definitely used for mana generation, and keep in mind that you can cancel it early, and that's where the mana on hit is coming from. It's not actually coming from your last hit. Technically, we could make our Flurry channel and function nearly identically to Barrage from Path of Exile, but ultimately the playstyle similarity there comes with a cost of reduced viability, so not really worth it in my opinion. I decided to use it as my engine instead of trying to gear for max damage, since the damage from Detonating Arrow is going to outpace it anyway. Speaking of that arrow, now let's take a look. Nothing super fancy here. I have a tier 1 affix with plus the level of Detonating Arrow, but you could just as easily take it off my gear and it'd be fine. The important nodes I mentioned earlier in this video are Barrage and Frostwing Arrow. They make the build click. Since we're using a skill that can freeze and running freeze multipliers on our gear, we'll be maxing out the freeze multi-nodes here on Gift of Ice. We take the minimum amount of infused discharge to open up that sweet, well-crafted node for more damage, and AoE on our Ice Shot Cone. And while our crit multiplier on Detonating Arrow and crit chance aren't quite as high of a bonus as some other skills get, I still take a couple of points into the weak spot node, not only for the crit multiplier, but also to give us more crit vulnerability, which we forewent in other aspects of the build. Last thing to mention is Navigator's Shot. While some of you might be lead gamers and you'll feel you'll never miss a shot, the slight investment for occasional auto-aim is really useful for the cost of 2 points. Plus you get a bit of chill effect, which is nice for the conversion. Alright, so let's take a look at the items. First off, the idols. I think the idol system is pretty neat, having chase items is dope, but I will mention that this build doesn't need these idols to work, it's just good to have them. All around good stuff, crit chance, elemental damage, and as you can see, I don't even own 4 of these, with the last idol having dodge. So, okay. Capping resistance, taking more hit points, more attack speed on bow hit, or even increasing your Detonating Arrow's AoE are all valid choices for the idol slot. Onto the items themselves. I'm using a Dreadthorn bow because we really like the crit multiplier, and I didn't feel the need for more increased damage that I can get from an Osprey's bow. I also got super lucky with this space. Really, who could say no to tier 7 attack speed and max roll? Juicy. But I've got to run with this more modest bow as well in this video. The tier 7 item doesn't really make or break it here. Besides that, most of the stuff is pretty standard, low budget, reasonable. I kept it simple and am playing with what items I can obtain, so if you're getting into the late game, sort of level 70 plus territory, all of this should be fairly achievable. The big things to note here are the uniques. Troaka's Teeth, and Morning Frost. The Tooth Quiver is a very strong damage buff, even if we aren't using Puncture or abusing Bleed or Frostbite. I have a really nicely rolled one, which I'm pretty pumped about, and if we compare it to an actual Farwood or Svalnir Quiver, the rares here, you can see the damage difference. Keep in mind, in actual combat with all of our buffs, the Svalnir Quiver will be pumping out slightly higher damage numbers due to the fact that the crit with buffs means more benefit from the crit multiplier implicit, but in my experience, it still didn't really beat a high rolled quiver, unique quiver in the end. Maybe an exalted item could? We'll find out. Like I mentioned before, the uniques don't make or break the build, and they're also pretty common, so you'll probably find them throughout your gameplay, or maybe you can get them from the gambler. Good luck with that, though. The Morning Frost will determine how you choose to make the build, or whether you have it or not, whether you like it or not. If you want to go full PoE, tryhard, deck stacking, ranger, eye shot, then it is great. And you'll see in my build it is what I decided to use. Sources of flat damage that aren't from weapons is quite rare and very strong in Last Epoch, so having all of this flat damage is awesome. But it does come with a trade-off in terms of balancing resistances. And as you can see, my resistances do still need some work. I've even got a ridiculous blessing for my reses, but they still aren't capped. If you want to use different base items, by the way, totally fine. I just like my poison res, even if it's the least important currently in the Last Epoch, and the meta, I suppose, that exists right now. You could use weathered coins instead of the ancient for the armor shred. You could use different rings or amulets to cover your defenses differently. Engraved gauntlets, perhaps, if you want some more value out of endurance. You know, all of those are fine choices. And while I've made this guide for you to refer to, I'd like to remind everyone that part of ARPGs is coming up with your own solutions to unique problems, and that could make it really, really fun. That just about does it. Hope you guys enjoyed the build, and if you'd like to see more, let me know. I've got some more so you want to play as concepts for Path of Exile expats like me in mind, but also some of my own original builds or spins on builds that I haven't really seen from Last Epoch content creators so far. It's a really fun game, and I'd love to create more content for it, so if you guys enjoyed this video, I'd be super happy. Till next time, travelers.